I'm Lynda Kinkade at the CNN Centre. As you've just been hearing, we do have some breaking news out of Syria where Russia is withdrawing some of their forces. The Russian president saying, according to state media, that the Russian military intervention has largely achieved its objectives. That's what the Russian state media, as I said, are reporting. The pullout is scheduled to begin as early as Tuesday. Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly ordered Russia to intensify its role in the peace process to end the conflict in Syria. Now, all of that was communicated to the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, in a phone call. Now, Matthew Chance is joining us on the phone now from Moscow. This obviously is a huge shock for the international community, those in Syria and those at the peace talks in Geneva. What are you hearing there?
Well, we're not hearing very much. I mean, as you mentioned, this is a surprise move. It's pretty much come out of the blue. It seems that the Russian military will be effectively pulling out of Syria as quickly as it went into Syria last year, and so it's yet again underlining this this very kind of guarded, very kind of strange. Strategy that the Russian president has been deploying, which is really defying any kinds of predictions. Apparently, according to state media, again, Vladimir Putin has said that this pullout will start on Tuesday. It will be the main part, they say, of their forces that have been deployed in Syria since late last year, carrying out multiple airstrikes, of course, against opposition groups in Syria, including ISIS and the al-Nusra Front, but also groups opposed to Bashar al-Assad. That presence has, of course, made an enormous difference on the ground to the conflict. It was the intervention of the Russian Air Force and the Russian military and the various others backing Bashar al-Assad that has essentially tipped the scales in favor of the Syrian government, prevented the government from falling, which is what many military observers had feared may happen, and essentially given it back or allowed it to advance and take back more territory to really kind of consolidate its position. Of course, the Russians say, at the same time as saying they'll pull out the main body of their forces, they're going to keep two military bases in Syria. So the port at Tartus on the Mediterranean, which they've had for many decades, will be maintained, and as will the Russian air base near Latakia, which is where the Russian Air Force has been based and where the airstrikes have been carried out from. So it won't be a complete withdrawal of Russian forces from Syria. There will be these still major military installations of the Russian military still in Syria. But nevertheless, again, this is a very surprising move by the Kremlin to announce that the main part of their forces now will be done because they say they've largely achieved their goals. And I think that's a result of the fact that the ceasefire that was brokered at the end of February, the cessation of hostilities rather, has largely held. And, now the emphasis from the Russian point of view is very much on a diplomatic solution, a political solution at these peace talks, which they hope to get restarted again in Geneva.
And I understand we do have some vision of the Russian President Vladimir Putin making that announcement. It is in Russian. We don't have the translation in English at this stage. Russia, of course, economically has been suffering, and Russia has spent a huge amount of money on fighting this war in Syria. What do you think the reaction will be, Matthew Chance, from the people in Russia?
Well, I think it will be. I think it could potentially be received very positively. I mean, I don't think the economic impact of the conflict in Syria has really been felt by ordinary Russians. I mean, there's certainly an economic crisis in this country, but it's largely to do with the low oil price. I mean, you could argue, of course, very strongly that the Russians just didn't have the financial capability to maintain a long-running conflict or a long-running military involvement in Syria, and that, in the end, may be one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, why Vladimir Putin has taken this very early opportunity to pull out the main part of his forces from Syria. But I think there's a sense in Russia that people think, and the government says this, and people are with them on this, that they've achieved something. Remember, before the Russians intervened in Syria, there was a very real prospect that Bashar al-Assad could have fallen. That could have had dire consequences for Syria, of course, and it certainly would have had dire consequences for the people in government-controlled territory, the loyalists, if you like, the Alawites, the Christians, perhaps, inside Syria. And I think there's a sense in which Russian people feel that the intervention of their military has actually stopped that catastrophe from happening. And so this has been, it was a very risky political move going into Syria like this. But of course, I think there's been a certain amount of payoff potentially for Vladimir Putin. He may have stabilized Syria. He may have brought the warring factions to the negotiating table. We'll see what these peace talks produce in Geneva. But I think he's also bolstered Russia's position on the international stage. Russia is now a player, not just in the Middle East now, but globally as a result of this intervention.
We also have Nic Paton Walsh, our senior correspondent, on the phone with us from Beirut. Nic, this war in Syria is entering its 6th year. As Matthew Chance alluded to, Russia says it has achieved its objectives there. What do you think the Syrian forces, the government forces, will make of them leaving as early as Tuesday?
Well, I think the interest here is exactly what political message Vladimir Putin is giving. When the Russian president discusses Russian military maneuvers, you have to take a degree of it at face value. It's always about the message within the statement that's being given rather than necessarily its practical effect. We'll have to wait and see in the days ahead how fast the actual realistic withdrawal of the forces is. It could take months, for example. But there's a very clear message here to perhaps the Syrian government and to the outside world that Russia is kind of done here, that it feels its task has been completed. Now, looking at the language here, Putin refers to military contingents, military factions, gruporovki, which would suggest we're talking about all of Russia's military, or a substantial amount. Remember, they've always had a military presence at a very small base in Tartus on the Mediterranean coast. The Syrian government has, according to reports by RIA Novosti, the Russian state news agency, expressed its thanks and acknowledged the enormous impact of Russian forces in assisting the Assad regime from holding its positions. That can be a no doubt, because until they intervened late last year, the Syrian army was on its back foot, being pushed back towards Latakia on the western coast near the Mediterranean, and really suffering. The Russian intervention turned that around markedly. The question you have to ask yourself now is, about 6 months in, what message is Moscow trying to give? There can be absolutely no avoiding the fact this message comes on the day that peace talks in Geneva under the auspices of the UN are beginning again. This is quite clearly designed to play into that. And if you look further into the statements from the Kremlin, in fact, they say how they would have agreed with Bashar al-Assad for the need to focus on a political process inside of Syria. This is perhaps a message from Moscow to Damascus or other forces in the region saying, we'd like to see this wound up politically, perhaps. Or there's something, perhaps, that we don't know about in public they would like to see occur, and they're using their military presence as some essence of leverage. They probably also, frankly, can't afford to be there much longer. And realistically on the ground, if you look at the sea change in the battlefield since their intervention, may feel they've achieved enough. They have pushed back the moderate rebels and some radicals in their midst a large distance. They've made Aleppo potentially much more vulnerable on its eastern rebel-held side than ever has been before. And they've taken a lot of the pressure off the route down from the north to the capital, Damascus. The Syrian military is in its best position it's been in for years at this stage as we head towards the 5th anniversary. The key question is, how fast does this withdrawal occur, and what's going on behind the scenes here? Because, there was a lot of speculation when, I don't know if you recall, a few months ago, when Bashar al-Assad was whisked in a Russian jet to the Kremlin. Some observing the body language there said he looked, frankly, a little taken back. There was a lot of speculation as to exactly what messages were being passed there. All of this discussion goes on beneath the surface. It's all smoke and mirrors. It always has been with the Kremlin ever since the Soviet days. The question really is, what exactly is happening here with the political process? There were some indications from Russian officials that perhaps they felt the red line that Syrian officials were throwing down, saying Bashar al-Assad's departure was simply non-negotiable, but that may have been a little bit too much. It's hard to really read exactly what's going on, but you can't ignore the timing of this and the symbolism. And Vladimir Putin, I've been observing this man's work for 16 years or so. He doesn't make big public statements like this on significant days like today unless there's a very specific agenda in the background. And I don't think you have to be a genius to work out what may be happening behind the scenes here, Lynda.
And Nic, what do you think the likelihood is that Russia will also put an end to its airstrikes as well as removing some of its ground troops?
Well, I think that's probably on the cards. I don't think that Vladimir Putin is making this statement because he intends to pull ground troops out and leave a powerful Russian Air Force presence here. Remember, we've seen social media pictures, unfortunately geotagged by their uploaders of Russian troops all over Syria, from Homs to Hama to Aleppo, even out potentially in other areas as well. They clearly have advisors or special forces in many parts of Syria. Their departure might necessarily turn things around overnight, and they may well have been on the ground to support the airstrikes. It is the air power that's been the most persuasive and, frankly, brutal part of the Russian intervention. And I think if Vladimir Putin says we're pulling out, he does mean them as well. He doesn't just mean the relatively small numbers of forces on the ground who'd be potentially providing logistical assistance to that wave of air power. This is a very strident move. Remember, the whole of the Ukrainian conflict, it was virtually impossible to get public open statements from the Kremlin about their military intent, despite constant drumbeat of Western officials saying actually it was real Russian military doing the fighting in eastern Ukraine. Here we have a very clear open statement of military intent from Vladimir Putin, and it's based on two things. It's based on him believing that they pretty much finished their task in fighting international terrorism. Now, you can debate that because the West says they haven't been attacking ISIS or the al-Qaeda affiliate in the Nusra Front. They've instead been going after more moderate forces who've always been leading the fight against the Syrian regime. But two, if you look at it as well, the second part of the message is that they've been talking to Bashar al-Assad and agreed the political process must move forward. That's what's supposed to be happening today in Geneva, and you can't ignore the timing of this very blatant and unusually public Russian announcement, Lynda.
Absolutely. Nic Paton Walsh in Beirut, Lebanon, and Matthew Chance in our bureau in Moscow. Thank you both very much. Stand by. We will come back to you on this breaking news of Russia pulling out some of its ground troops from Syria. We will be back in just a short moment.